American Republic, what's happening? It is Tuesday, it's Spirit Week. So keep that in mind and wear your shirts and celebrate our school, even though we're doing it online this week. And you'll see a video on Facebook and other places talking about Spirit Week. And I know your other teachers hopefully are talking about it as well. I know you were supposed to read pages 403 through 410, I believe it was. We were going to do that last Monday. We ended up doing it this Monday. So we're going to be hard-pressed to finish a lot of the materials for this year, but we're going to get the major points. And World War I was a major point, and I just want to go through a few things, and we're going to finish this chapter and be tested on it this week. So keep that in mind. But you were supposed to read it, so I'm just going to hit some highlights of some things in this chapter, or this section. And I'll probably stop at page 408, and we'll finish up with the remainder of the chapter tomorrow, or I may get to it today. We'll see. But page 403, let's start there. The United States enters the war. Now, the United States was not prepared for World War I. We just weren't. We had about 200,000 soldiers. We had just a few guns, a few hours worth of ammunition. Was not a good setup for the United States. So, what we did is what we did during the Civil War. We started a draft. We drafted folks and said, hey, you, and you, come on, you're fighting for the United States. One of the things we had to be careful about, your book mentions this, is traveling. The Germans had all of these submarines, and they were just firing at ships. And so we sent all of our ships in convoys, and it worked well. The convoy system worked so well that we didn't lose a single person of the 2 million that were transported to Europe. We ended up with about 2 million soldiers going over there. None of them were lost at sea. So pretty impressive stuff. One of the things that I wanted to mention, Dixie cups. A few years before the war broke out in Europe, an American named Hugh Moore had an idea of a new kind of cup. He was trying to sell water at a penny a cup. And customers were not especially interested in paying for water, but they did like the paper cups that he used. We also had some health issues at the time we're going to talk about next. They had used communal cups, like you would have a cup, a dipper, that type of thing at a public drinking place. And so Dixie cups were little bitty cups, and they were called Moore's Health Cups originally, health cups, and they ended up calling them the Dixie cup. And he, that you could serve anything from Coca-Cola in them eventually to ice cream, little cups of water, lemonade, that type of thing. The reason you had to be so careful is there was a flu. And I think it's very fitting that we talk about the flu. And it was influenza. Ended up being called the Spanish flu. Now, it's not believed to have started in Spain. It's actually believed to have started in Fort Riley, Kansas. And there was a dust storm in March of 1917, and more than 1,000 soldiers got sick with the flu. 46 of them died, and then they sent that regiment to France, and guess what? It spread like wildfire. In fact, 80% of some units, military units, died because of the Spanish flu or the influenza. Some ships that were sent over to Europe, the convoy system worked well for keeping them safe from submarines, but sometimes 20% of those on the ships, 20% of the folks on the ships would die. In 4 months, your book mentions this, influenza killed 21 million people worldwide. So that makes COVID look like nothing in comparison. 21 million people died worldwide. In 1 week, the last week of October 1917, 2,700 American soldiers, 2,700 American soldiers died in combat, but 21,000 in 1 week American citizens died of the flu in the United States. So it was a bad thing. All right, so that's why you have to have cups and things of that nature, that you're not drinking out of the same thing as other folks. That's why um, things like Dixie cups take off. One of the things that we had to do as a nation was create things, um, guns, bullets, tanks, ships, and we'll see this in World War II as well. But we had to create a war machine. In other words, the economy had to be geared toward war. And one of the things we started was the War Industries Board. Your book mentions that. It was organized to basically do what we're seeing now. A lot of this relates to what's going on right now. You've seen in the news where maybe 3M and Chrysler and different Ford, they've been making masks, or PPE as it's called. They've also been making ventilators, that type of thing. And the president used a War Powers Act to get them to do this. In some cases, most of the time they volunteered, but sometimes he had to say, hey, y'all are going to do this. And that's what happened during World War I. We had this War Industries Board, and you would tell Ford, hey, you're going to stop making cars today and you're going to build tanks. Done. So, but America created a lot of stuff, and this helped. We also had to conserve at home. We needed to hang on to what we had. And they put a guy by the name of Herbert Hoover. Now, you're going to see Herbert Hoover later on. He's going to become president. But they put him in charge of the Food Administration. They got people to plant gardens. They tried to, like meatless Mondays and things of that nature, to try to get people to cut back in America. About 4 million men overall were drafted. That creates a problem in the workforce, because if all these men are going off to war, that's 4 million people or thereabouts out of the workplace, out of the factories, out of the stores. Who's going to fill the void? Well, in some cases, retired men too old to go to war, that type of thing. But also women started working a lot. Prices went up. The cost to the federal government was astronomical. We spent about $24 billion. Our allies borrowed about $8 billion from us. And a lot of it was raised from a new income tax. You remember an amendment to the Constitution that says the federal government can have an income tax. And a lot of the monies raised to fund the war effort came from this tax. Now, you got to pay for it somehow. The United States can't go out even today and just print money and say, here it is, because it becomes valueless. You can print a lot of money, but it has no value behind it. There has to be something backing the money, so to speak. And so you can raise taxes. That gets the federal government some money. But another thing they did is they had to borrow money. And the government can't just go to the First State Bank or whatever and borrow money. So they would borrow it from the people in the form of war bonds and those type of things. So they would go door to door, and they would have liberty and victory drives and those type of things, and they would try to raise funds for the war. I found it interesting, a couple of things. Gotta have a swig of water. And I'm about out. Have to refill it with some of Rainsville's finest tap water. A couple of toys came out of this era. Some of you may have never heard these. Hopefully the ladies in this class have. The Raggedy Ann doll, Raggedy Ann and Andy. They were based on two children's stories at the time, The Raggedy Man and Little Orphan Annie, and they combined Raggedy and Annie together and came up with Raggedy Ann doll. If you're unfamiliar with it, look up a picture. You've probably seen one before. Then they came up with the counterpart, Andy, later on in 1920. Another toy, I've never had a Raggedy Ann or Andy, but I did have these and loved them. I loved them. I would play with them right now on the floor. If I had a set, I think maybe some in the boys' room. I'll go look. Lincoln Logs. Lincoln Logs came about during this time. They had been developed later on, or earlier, but John Lloyd Wright, who was also an architect and the son of Frank Lloyd Wright, who was a famous architect, actually built a house, designed a house over in the Florence and Muscle Shoals area. If you ever get a chance, go see it. But he designed these toy-sized logs, and you would build them, and they had these planks that you would put on the roof, and you could build little log cabins. They had little short ones, and they had longer ones, and then they had some real long ones to do long runs with. Great stuff. But Lincoln Logs came about during this time, so a lot of developments as well, especially for kids. George M. Cohan, he was one of the most popular patriotic songwriters of the time, and he wrote a song called Over There. Over there, over there, send the word over there. He also wrote Yankee Doodle Dandy. He wrote You're a Grand Old Flag. You're a grand old flag, you're a high-flying flag. And just wrote a bunch of songs. Patriotism becomes needed. And also propaganda was big at this time. You'll see on page 405 a poster. You wanted to generate support for the boys overseas. And so you would do that with posters, you would do that with films, you would do that with pictures, you would do that with patriotic songs like George M. Cohan that he wrote. You'll see, starting on page 406, some of the things that happened. First of all, the Americans fought separately. They fought side by side with the Allies, but they fought as one troop. They didn't put Americans under the command of French leaders and English leaders, those type of things, generals. The Americans were called two different things, doughboys. We never have figured out exactly why they were called doughboys, D-O-U-G-H-B-O-Y-S, but that's what they were called. Also, Yanks, like Yankees, and so they were called Yanks. The thing about it, the Americans didn't come in and just kick a lot of bootay, so to speak. We didn't go in and set the world on fire with our fighting. A lot of times we were using men that had been trained about 3 months. They had minimum weaponry, and they went over there and started fighting. It wasn't like, we were the star fighting force. But the morale, when you see thousands of American troops arriving weekly, it boosts the morale of the French and the English. And they're like, hey, we can do this. We've got the Americans on our side now. We can do it. Russians dropped out of the war. You had the big Russian revolt. Their czar was overthrown, and so Vladimir Lenin goes back to Russia, and they drop out of the war. And one thing that Germany wanted to do, they wanted to take Paris. Now, in World War II, that'll be fairly easy. But in World War I, they made it all the way to the Marne River. And we really started to fight back. And you see a couple of battle names and place names. Chateau Thierry. You also see Belleau-Wood. And about 250,000 American soldiers were arriving weekly. And the Allies, as I mentioned before, they were like, hey, we can do this. We also launched an offensive into the Argonne Forest. And we basically just wore the Germans down. They started getting frustrated. They started getting tired. And they lost their will to fight. We drove them back. And Paul von Hindenburg, he knew that they couldn't win. This is the cool thing. 11 a.m. on November, which is the 11th month of November the 11th. So you've got 11 o'clock, 11th month, 11th day in 1918. So November the 11th at 11 o'clock, 1918, the war ended. It was Armistice Day. It became a holiday called Armistice Day. And now you know, hopefully, that we celebrate Veterans Day on November the 11th. It ended the war. 8 million lives were taken. About 20 million people were injured. American casualties, we had about 200,000 wounded. We lost about 115,000 men killed. So about 315,000 lives were changed, either lost or 200,000 injured. So the war was costly. You're also going to see an excerpt on page 408 about Alvin C. York. He was from Tennessee. Great man, great Christian, and I'm going to attach a little short video I want you to watch about Alvin. You can go to the Alvin C. York State Park in Tennessee. I believe it's north of Knoxville. But Alvin York was a great character. Looking at page 409, 4010. Let's just look real quickly and we'll get this done. You had the Paris Peace Conference. You had the Treaty of Versailles. Make sure you read about those. David Lloyd George represented Britain. Victoria Orlando represented Italy. And you also had George Clemenceau. He was the French premier. And you will see President Wilson represented the United States. Now, Wilson is going to be big on what is called the League of Nations. The United States will never approve that. It was the forerunner to the United Nations. But you see a picture of David George and Orlando and Clemenceau and Woodrow Wilson there on page 409. They get together for the Treaty of Versailles. One of the things they wanted to do was make Germany pay for the war. They blamed the war on Germany. They wanted them to pay for it. It's going to cripple Germany, and it's going to cause a lot of worldwide tension. And later on, this whole idea is in part going to be what makes Germany so mad that they're like, hey, let's start another war. Why not? American responses, he took the treaty to the Senate, and approval is required for all treaties. A lot of people were not happy with it, and a lot of people did not want to ratify the treaty. Wilson would not make changes. He wanted all or nothing. It became a deadlock, and we never did ratify the treaty. The nation simply declared that war was over. So, and the impact of the war, you'll read about that. That's on page 410. Don't want you to do any, says low power. There we go. Don't want you to do any section quizzes tonight, but I do want you to review, because tomorrow we are going to have an open book test. We went ahead and got through this. We've got to move quickly on this material as we near the end of the year. So make sure you read over it again. Make sure you know where things are in the chapter. Y'all done well. Reminder, don't use Google on everything. I know the temptation is great, but last time, as I mentioned, some of y'all were giving me somebody that was under Lyndon B. Johnson's administration instead of Andrew Johnson. And I was like, who is this guy they keep naming? And I Googled the question, and it pulled the same thing up. So be careful with that. I know it's open book. Do what you need to do. Y'all are doing well. Every one of you is doing well, and I'm proud of you. I do miss you. And watch the video on Alvin C. York. It's short, and you will be done for today, but we will have an open book test tomorrow. Love y'all. Praying for you. Miss you. Talk to you.